Well, a warm welcome to today's talk. It's Wednesday, the 12th of January. Now, today I want to look at reduction in hospitalisations amongst people infected with Omicron. And we've got some rather nice data that's starting to come out of the United States now, particularly from California. And we also want to look at natural immunity, because there's some new evidence now that when people have been exposed to the natural coronaviruses that cause common cold, then that's going to give them greater levels of protection against SARS coronavirus 2. So quite interesting really. Now, just before we plough into the American data, I just want to show you something from Netherlands first of all. Now, here's data from the Netherlands, and this is quite an amazing graphic, this. So what we have here is we have the reduction in the Delta variant here. And just it's almost like a mathematical opposite, the increase in the Omicron. And now, of course, Omicron is predominant. So the crossover point was what? Well, that's December, that's January, just sort of the end of December. So just really quite amazing the way that the Omicron has essentially taken over from the Delta in that Dutch data. Now, moving on to the theme of hospitalisations, I just want to show you some more Dutch data here. Now, these were projections that were made in, I think it was early December for the Netherlands, for the virologist that consulted with informed the Dutch Parliament. And these are various scenarios of hospitalisations with Omicron infection. So this is the most optimistic scenario here. Then the actual cases are way better than the most optimistic scenario. Now, it's just from a Twitter thing there, so it's not that good. But we can see it's about, what, 1,373, I think that is, hospitalisations. But the point is, it's way better than the worst scenario, the middle case scenario, and the best case scenario. It's even way better under the error bars of the best case scenario. So I thought that was pretty interesting and pretty good news, really. Now, moving on to this Californian study. Clinical outcomes amongst patients infected with Omicron, SARS coronavirus 2 variant in Southern California. So the background, of course, is Omicron is sweeping the world, accounting for most infections in the United States by December 2021. I suppose roughly the crossover time in the States was similar to that one we've just seen from the Netherlands. But now we know that Omicron is at least 95% of the cases in the United States, probably higher than that. Omicron has just taken over, and Omicron has essentially now replaced Delta, which is good news, as we've looked at many times. So this data is from November the 30th, 2021, till the end of to beginning of January. So this is basically data for December, isn't it? Delta v Omicron. Now, the thing about this period of time is this is when Omicron was taking over from Delta. So we had a time when there was Delta hospitalisations and Omicron hospitalisations together, so the two could be compared, which of course makes perfect sense. A unique opportunity to do that. So you couldn't repeat this study now because there's not enough Delta cases around to be able to do it anymore. Right. So using S gene target failure to identify Omicron. And they found out when they did genomic analysis that was accurate 99.7% of the time. So this S gene target failure, or this S gene deletion, at least in the California situation, is a very accurate way to assess whether the infection was Omicron or Delta. And if it had the S gene target failure, it was Omicron. And of course, they were looking at hospital admissions. They were looking at length of hospital stay, hospital admissions associated with new onset respiratory symptoms, intensive care unit admissions, mechanical ventilation, and of course deaths. They were looking at all those things. Now, the first group they looked at was the Omicron group. And of course, as time went on, the Omicron group got bigger, and as time went on, the Delta group got smaller, as you would expect. But they're able to get pretty good data. So Omicron cases, over 52,000 cases with Omicron variant infections. Now, hospital admissions from the 52,000 cases that were diagnosed. Now, remember, these are cases, of course. The actual number of infections in this collection area will be way higher than that. So hospital admissions were 0.5% of those diagnosed. So only like 0.1% or something of infections, or 0.2% of infections. Anyway, there's 235 cases, 0.5%. Now, these were followed up for 5.5 days. Now, they couldn't follow them up for as long because the Omicron cases weren't hospitalised for as long. They were in hospital for about 70% less time on average with Omicron, which in itself is encouraging. 88 were actually admitted. So there was 235 that went to emergency rooms and things like that, but 88 actually admitted to hospital. 7 were admitted to ITU. 0 went on mechanical ventilation. And in the whole Omicron group, there was 1 death. And the length of hospital stay was typically 3.4 days, as we said, 70% less than Delta. So quite a lot turning up for hospitalisation, but not that many actually being admitted. Now, if we compare this with Group 2, which was the non-Omicron, which we know is the Delta, of course, there was 16,000, let's say 17,000 cases there. Hospital admissions there were 222, so that's 1.3%, whereas the Omicron had been 0.5%. Mean follow-up days were 15.5, so they were hanging around for much longer and could be followed up, as opposed to a mean follow-up of 5.5 days. From this group, there was 189 actually admitted into hospital. 23 were actually admitted into intensive care. 11 were ventilated and 14 died. And if we look at the Omicron equivalents there, it was 7 in intensive care as opposed to 23. 0 ventilated with Omicron, 11 ventilated with Delta, 1 death with Omicron, 14 deaths with Delta. So really pretty stark differences and consistent with what we've been thinking and saying for quite some time. Now, this study went on to do some more thinking. Omicron variant infections reduce risk of hospitalizations across age and comorbidity categories. So this is pretty important. So we were worried about this. But what this is saying is that if you're infected with Omicron, regardless of your age, you're less likely to be admitted. So a 2-year-old infected with Omicron, less likely to be admitted than a 2-year-old infected with Delta. An 80-year-old infected with Omicron, less likely to be admitted than an 80-year-old infected with Delta. So the reason that if this data is correct, if this pans out to be generally true, and it's looking true so far, what this means is the increase in paediatric admissions that has been seen in the United States is due to the simply massive amount of Omicron cases that have been presenting all at once. For any given age group, you're less likely to be admitted with Omicron than you are with Delta. And the same with comorbidities. So if you're diabetic and you get Omicron, you're less likely to be admitted than if you're diabetic with Delta. So it was true. Omicron variant infections reduce risk of hospitalizations across age and comorbidity categories. So that really is pretty good news. Risk of symptomatic hospitalizations were markedly reduced amongst cases who tested for positive SARS coronavirus 2. Greater than, so that's more than 90 days prior for 3 months. So even if someone had the natural infection more than 3 months ago, and of course some of them would have had the natural infection well over a year ago now, then they were still less likely to be hospitalised. So risk of symptomatic hospitalisation was markedly reduced among cases who tested positive for SARS coronavirus 2. In other words, they had natural immunity because they've been exposed to the actual virus, in this case the SARS coronavirus 2. So we're seeing that this natural exposure to SARS coronavirus 2, and as we'll see in a minute, other coronaviruses, is protective, and it's looking like it's protective longer term. So natural immunity seems to be giving longer term good quality protection against symptomatic hospitalisation, as this data shows us. They conclude that the illness is intrinsically less severe, the infection is less severe, again consistent with other data that we have been seeing. So initially we didn't know whether it was people who had immunity or the infection was intrinsically less severe. We now know both is true. The infection is intrinsically less severe, so if someone's never been vaccinated and they get Omicron, they're much less likely to be hospitalised than someone who's never been vaccinated who gets Delta. So the natural immunity is having an effect, but we also know it's intrinsically less pathogenic. Less severe in vaccinated and unvaccinated. So if you're vaccinated or unvaccinated, again, less likely to have severe disease in Omicron compared to Delta. Now, that's not saying that people who were vaccinated didn't have more protection. They did. They did indeed, and the authors were keen to point this out. So, direct quote: evidence for a reduction in severe outcomes among vaccinated cases with both Delta and Omicron variants infection suggests in our study suggests substantial public benefit from continued COVID-19 vaccination. So, what they're saying was, whatever your age, whatever your comorbidities, whatever your vaccine status, compared to other people of your age with your comorbidity or other people with your vaccine status, you're always less likely to be admitted with Omicron compared to Delta. So that's really pretty good news. Now, that was the Dutch data we looked at there. Obviously, it's in Dutch, so it's a bit difficult. That's I've given you my understanding of it. Now, moving on to this next paper we wanted to look at, common cold protection. This is cross-reactivity memory T cells. So the memory T cells we know are the ones that give longer lasting immunity. And cross-reactivity means that these people have been exposed to one of the 4 coronaviruses that cause the common cold. But they found that they also had enhanced immunity to SARS coronavirus 2. Now, of course, this is one of the things we've been wondering about since the start of the pandemic. We had some people in the same age and with the same comorbidities at the start. Some had minimally symptomatic disease, some who sadly died or admitted to intensive care. So it turns out that one of these variables that we couldn't see, if they'd been exposed to a coronavirus common cold in the 6 months, year, possibly even 18 months, probably not more than 2 years before. So another reason to sort of get out there and mix with viruses and get this natural immunity. Cross-reactive immune response to SARS coronavirus 2 from the 4 common cold coronaviruses. Yes, there is. Here they tested 52 COVID-19 household contacts, so people who would definitely be exposed to the virus. We enumerated the frequency of specific T cells, and they looked at the way the T cells responded to the spike protein, the nucleocapsid proteins. That's the ones right inside associated with the RNA, membrane protein, envelope protein, and ORF1, which is a functional protein. It's basically an enzyme that cross-react with human endemic coronaviruses. So there's these 4 endemic human coronaviruses, and these are giving cross-protection. So it really makes you wonder why we didn't have a vaccine much earlier on based on these common cold coronaviruses, which we now know are giving protection. But we have actually suspected that they gave protection right since January 2020, but we haven't known till now. So it's taken 2 years basically. We speculated on it in January 2020. Now January 2022, we know that there is cross immunity. So infection with the SARS, infection with the coronavirus that causes common cold will give cross immunity to SARS coronavirus 2. And the one that was particularly effective was the nucleocapsid protein. So you remember that we have the virus, and of course we have the spikes and the spike proteins, as we know. With these spike proteins, then we have the RNA inside, like that. Well, the nucleocapsid protein antigen is the one that's actually associated with these the RNA right inside. But also there's envelope ones as well. But the one that was specifically good was the nucleocapsid T cells. But of course, none of the vaccines that we have generate immunity against this. So the natural immunity is generating T cells that are able to respond against the SARS coronavirus 2 nucleocapsid protein, and therefore eradicate the whole virus, because it's seeing that as the foreign material, the epitope or the antigen. But none of the vaccines went for that. But the natural infection does, of course, because in natural infection, we're exposed to all parts of the virus, not just the spike proteins. They found limited protective function of spike cross-reactive T cells. So, in other words, when you're exposed to the spike protein of a common cold coronavirus, that didn't give you much cross-immunity against the spike protein of the SARS coronavirus 2. But with the internal proteins, if you're exposed to the internal proteins of the natural common cold coronavirus, that did give you cross-immunity to these natural internal proteins of the SARS coronavirus 2, causing the COVID-19. So again, really showing what you could argue to be the superiority of natural infection and exposure. And the reason I'm sort of emphasizing this now is, of course, that even though we're having a difficult time now with Omicron, millions of us are being exposed. So I'm really hopeful about the long-term immunity and the quality of that longer-term immunity that we're getting from this natural exposure, because we know we get good immunity from exposure to the 4 common cold coronaviruses we already have. Therefore, it also seems very likely that we'll get good natural immunity to the Omicron variant, and we already know that exposure to the Omicron variant gives good antibody neutralizing protection against Delta variant. So it's looking very encouraging for the memory T cells, which is going to give us our long-term immunity, of course. Our results are thus consistent with pre-existing non-spike cross-reactivity memory T cells. So pre-existing non-spike, so not the spike, cross-reactivity of the memory T cells. In other words, it's the internal proteins that are generating most of the T cell response, not the spike proteins. Protection against SARS coronavirus 2 naive contacts from infection. So if you've never come in contact with SARS coronavirus 2, but if in the past year or so, or 18 months, you've come into contact with 1 or 2, or presumably 3 or 4 would be even better, of these natural common cold coronaviruses, you get a good degree of protection. So it will, I think we can say, will be the same again with Omicron, because the Omicron, of course, is even more similar to SARS coronavirus 2, because it is a SARS coronavirus 2. It's not a common cold coronavirus, obviously. Thereby supporting inclusion of non-spike antigens in second-generation vaccines. Now, that's not being done at the moment. So, non-spike antigens. So why did all the vaccines go for the spike protein? Presumably because it gave the neutralizing antibodies, but that's not what's having the effect, really. The long-term effect is the T cells. And of course, every immunologist in the world knows that, but for some strange reason, the vaccine developers didn't go for it. So strange. I really not quite sure why they wouldn't go for it. Of course, the Chinese vaccine did, and some of the vaccines that went for the whole virus, the whole attenuated virus, because that will give you immunity to all of the all of the antigens, all of the epitopes in the SARS coronavirus 2, because it is a SARS coronavirus 2. It's the whole virus, but that's not stimulating the T cells as well as we would like it to. So there we go. Pretty good news on hospitalizations with Omicron. The risk is down in all ages and categories and comorbidities. Therefore, if there is more of a particular age group admitted, that is just because of the sheer volume of numbers. The risk to any individual is less. And we have this cross-immunity, which is absolutely brilliant between different coronaviruses, making me very optimistic about the immunity that's going to be generated by this Omicron wave. Now, just to finish, I've just got an email from some doctor friends in India. Now, I haven't got permission to say who they are yet, so I'm not going to say, but they are respected physicians, known to friends of mine who are doctors in India. I'm just going to read you some of the things that they have come out with, and it's very reassuring because these doctors have been doing their own research in India. And they're coming to the same conclusions as people working in the United States, people who've been working in South Africa, but these doctors have been working independently. So that is very reassuring. And the doctors that have sent this email have actually treated 20,000 patients between them. So Omicron, Delta, Alpha, the whole range of SARS coronavirus 2 patients all through the outbreak. And this is what they say. Omicron is the most infectious respiratory virus the world has ever seen. Now, I was a bit taken aback by that, because now what we had looked at before, here we have this. Now, this is when Delta first came out. So here we have a faster spread, and there we have more deadly. So this was the ancestral form here, which didn't spread as well. And then the Delta form spread more. Measles, of course, is the most transmissible disease I've known of personally. So what we find out is that Omicron is maybe down here somewhere, about here, because it's less virulent, but it's much more transmissible. So it's probably round about there somewhere. And these doctors are actually saying Omicron is the most infectious respiratory virus the world has ever seen. So are they saying it's more infectious than measles? Wow. It looks like they are. I mean, just wow. I mean, measles is so transmissible. If someone's in a room breathing out measles, and everyone in that room's got a 90% chance of being exposed to it. So they're actually saying that we know it's less pathogenic, so it's down here, intrinsically less pathogenic. It's the most infectious respiratory virus, apparently, according to these doctors. So it's up there with measles. Now, if you know of a more infectious respiratory virus, if you're a virologist or something, do let me know. But that's direct from these physicians in India. 3 to 5 times more infectious than Delta, which of course was already more infectious than the original B.1.1 strain, and indeed was more effective than the Alpha strain that it replaced. We can safely say 90% of the current infections in India are Omicron, and of course infections in India are really scooting up just now. The milder symptoms seem mainly due to upper respiratory tract infection. So again, they're saying it's affecting the upper airways, intrinsically less infectious, but also due to the immunity, and there is a lot of immunity in India as well. But they're agreeing that it's the upper airways rather than the lungs that are being infected. Vaccine does not prevent Omicron infection, but does seem to protect against severe disease and hospitalisation. So same thing as we're finding here. Omicron is not preventing the vaccines are not preventing symptomatic infection, certainly not completely, but do seem to protect against severe disease. So again, the Indian doctors having exactly the same findings as the South African, United States and British scientists. Omicron does not affect the lung, and therefore 70% less chance of admission, they're saying. 70% less chance of being admitted. Rather consistent with the California data. So it's always reassuring when different data is derived from completely different countries using different methodologies, and that data agrees. That's very reassuring. In only 10% was oxygen required. All the patients who required oxygen, so all the patients that are admitted, the few that were admitted, relative few that were admitted, only 10% required oxygen, whereas before it was about 90% of people required oxygen. All of the people that required oxygen, and this is in about 20,000, well, they've treated several thousand patients lately, about 20,000 altogether. All the patients that required oxygen recently were over 70 years old or had comorbidities. The doctors are recommending booster vaccines if possible. Try and get a different vaccine than the primary one, is what they're saying. This is not what we're advising, this is just reporting what these Indian doctors are saying. Obviously, they're looking for the polyclonal response. The available antibody cocktail is useless in Omicron. So this is the monoclonal antibodies they have in India, it's just not working at all. It's become a fad amongst the rich. Please stop asking for it, they say. Mixed opinions on molnupiravir. If recommended at all, to be given on day 4 or 5 if fever or cough not coming down or increasing, or in elderly patients with comorbidities. So molnupiravir not going down particularly well in India. So there we are, a few interesting things to think about. Difficult time now, but encouraging for immunity soon. Cases of Omicron probably peaked now in the UK. United States got a couple of weeks to go. After that, the numbers will start going down, I believe, but hospitalisations are going to be an ongoing problem in the United States due to the sheer number of people and due to the comorbidities in the United States, which is also going to be a factor, and the older age group demographic, which is probably why hospitals in the States are under such a lot of strain now compared to somewhere like Netherlands, for example. Okay, thank you for watching.